afternoon, and welcome to this week's episode of Level Up Cyber. My name is Tony Bryan, Executive Director of Cyber Up, and your host for today's show. I'm very excited about today's guest, Kristi Cook with Peabody Energy. Kristi, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So Kristi and I were just we were catching up before we hopped on and getting ready for today's show, and realized I think we've been hanging out almost 8 years. I mean, almost as long as I can remember. We were kind of reminiscing of I used to go to her classes and talk to her students about just things that Cyber Up has done. So it's been a long time. So excited to spend the next 30 or so minutes. She's an incredible human, has had a great career, and I think not just has received the accolades from her own self, but has helped so many other people in their careers. So she's a great kind of testament for the conversation we're going to have today. So before we jump in, I know you pretty well, but not everybody else does. So I'd love to have you just take a second, introduce yourself, introduce a little bit about your career and really your story of how you got to where you're at today.
Awesome. Thank you. Of course. So I have a little bit of an unusual background. Like many other people, especially on the management side of the house in cybersecurity, I have both a bachelor's degree and a master's degree. And this is what tends to spark a little bit of interest. So my bachelor's degree is actually in military history. Yes, I was the usual college student that was like, I think this is great. This is interesting. I have no idea what I'm going to do with it. But then I decided, hey, museums are awesome. And I got very interested in how museums function and how they tell stories about the world and how they tell stories about societies and people. So I decided to go on and I got my master's degree in museum administration, specifically focusing on history, military history. I did a lot of art and how art is a result of conflict globally and in society. Unfortunately for me at that time, it was around 2008 where we had a big financial crisis in the United States, which really impacted a lot of federal funding towards nonprofit organizations at that point in time. So a lot of places I was considering going after I got my master's degree, specifically around, working in museums and nonprofits, just didn't have the funding. And a lot of them were on strict hiring freezes. So I had one of those points that a lot of us do, said, what now? I actually had my brother came up to me and said, hey, have you ever considered, looking into the military? I was like, I mean, I study it, so it's actually not a terrible idea. So I ended up going into military intelligence. So I commissioned as an officer in 2012, and 2 weeks prior to my commissioning, I get a phone call, and it was from the branch manager for military intelligence for the state of Missouri. He said, hey, I've got a proposal for you. And I was like, okay, what's up? And the branch manager said, we've got this new team we're putting together in Missouri, and we would really like to see how you would fit in this team. And I was like, I mean, okay, what kind of new team would a state be starting? Because this is called a cyber team. I'm going to be honest, I don't really know exactly what all it means, but they work in the computers and defensive computers, and a lot of people were really excited about it. And they thought that you might be a great fit. And I had one of those ideas where I was like, all due respect, sir, this is a terrible idea. I don't know how to turn my computer on by myself. I was like, I'm an artsy girl. I'm a history girl. I don't know that this is the place for me. He said, well, there's some people on the team that saw your resume and they're very insistent. So why don't we just give it a shot, see how it goes? And I was like, okay, I mean, you're the boss, so I'm along for the ride. You station me where you want to. So I go through my intelligence officer training. I come back, I go to my first drill, and I apologize to the team. I said, guys, I'm gonna be honest, I don't know why I'm here. I'm sorry, I'm gonna be very little help. I'm not technical. I don't know how to do any of this fancy smart people stuff, but I work at a winery. So if you guys need some great recommendations on wine for parties, I'm your girl. So I will do my best. Well, what I would say is that there was actually a plan in place at this point in time that I really didn't understand. And it was this merging of cybersecurity and intelligence to form threat intelligence. And at this point, it was kind of this guessing game. There was a lot of people throughout the US, on the federal side and military side, had this inkling that this belonged here, and nobody really knew how it fit or how it understood. So they were trying to get some people together that understood threat actors, that understood the history, that understood how people do things and why, and meshing that into our traditional cyber operational defense procedures and roles at this point. So we kind of kicked off. We went to about 6 months later, our first capture the flag. It was called Cyber Shield, for anyone that's familiar with it. So it was one of the early days of the Cyber Shield exercise, and our team was actually able to identify the activity patterns of the red team by day 3 of the 5-day exercise, and kind of put a halt on the exercise. And it was a result of implementing some of the traditional intelligence processes into place with the cyber games, and it worked awesome. It was a lot of fun, and that was kind of the moment where I said, maybe this is where I'm supposed to be. Say, yes, there's a lot of technical things. There is the IP addresses and the, computer systems and all of this. I have a ton left to learn. I was like, but those are the weapons systems that I'm learning about in the books. That's just the weapons systems of today. And it was kind of that moment where all of this really clicked for me. And I said, let's see what happens. Coming back from that exercise, I actually went on active duty for the team for several months before I went on to joining on the civilian side. Stayed with my military team, for about 8 years. But I went on to a managed security provider, Fishnet Security. Worked for them for a while before I went over to work for Charter Spectrum. And now I've been at Peabody Energy for about 8 years, where I'm now the senior manager of the global cybersecurity team. I hold my CISSP and GCIH, and I can't imagine being anywhere else at this point.
One, I'm just thinking of just how crazy the sentiment of just how 10 years ago, the correlation between intelligence and cyber, and just the early conversations of those, and really how quickly we've evolved in a 10 to 12 year period of technology. But we've evolved a lot, but we haven't really evolved that much in the grand scheme, right? We have a lot of cool toys, and I think there's still a lot to be learned in that. But, kudos to you to seeing the parallel early and jumping in. You've also spent a lot of time, teaching, educating others, through colleges and traditional pathways, and I think both non-traditional pathways and mentorship. I'd love to tell a little bit more about that, just kind of that idea around just education and what has kind of drawn you towards teaching others. That, would be a great question.
Yeah. So, I think one of the reasons, LevelUp exists is we have this conversation about there's this huge shortage of cybersecurity professionals out there, right? And it kind of, stuck with me, right? What initially prevented me from getting into cybersecurity was that I'm not that person. I'm not techie. I don't have those skills. But the reality is that cybersecurity isn't a single skill set. It takes all sorts of different people, all sorts of different skills, all sorts of different personalities even to make a full cybersecurity team successful. And that's one conversation that I strive to have, both whenever I go to conferences, when I have with my students, is that there's a place for you, but you also have to take ownership of finding out what that place is, right? There are the developers out there. There are the engineers. There are the legal risk and compliance personnel. There's the analysts. There's the guys that are going to work on making sure that everything actually works in the background correctly. And so it's not just you're cyber or not. You have to find where your place is, and there's a spectrum of that by far.
That's a great transition into our first transition tip, right? So thanks to everybody who kind of weighed in on the survey and gave some feedback. And we jumped a little bit in a conversation before I hopped on so now maybe I find myself in your shoes, right? We rewind 10, 12 years ago, and somebody's, looking at, what I'm going to back. There's that where you started 12 years ago, the conversations that we're having today around just the skills gap and lack of people didn't exist. So I think it's impossible now for somebody to not see the impact cyber has on every single thing. But, for somebody who's, seeing this information and thinking, okay, maybe they find themselves in their shoes, or I can't do this. What advice would you give to them around that idea of transitioning, taking your current role and finding, your way in many of the areas you just described? What advice would you give to those folks to make that transition from where they're at into cyber?
I think cyber is actually one of the easiest places or easiest career changes to make, in the sense of there are a ton of free resources out there. But you also have to be willing to advertise and market yourself and, put the work into it. So, go online and do, free training classes that you can take, identify what skills, are you find yourself being passionate about. What is it that you want to get involved in? Do self-research, self-study, look things up. You don't have to have a list mile high of certifications to get known. You just simply have to be able to put yourself out there. I think one of the great things about cybersecurity, and even maybe IT, on a larger element too, is we have a very small, niche group. And we really do. There's so many people that we run into that know each other from here or there. But going to different conferences and local events, and just being willing to talk to people is one of the big things that are going to, I guess, make yourself stand out compared to other people, is just by getting to know people that are already in the industry. And most of us are pretty approachable, surprisingly. I know a lot of times you're like, oh, techie people, they don't like to associate with others. But you'll find a lot of us are very active in the industry, and just attending them, having conversations, and not being afraid to ask questions is really what's going to make somebody stand out and be able to make that leap and find a position that's right for them.
I'm going to come up with a different wrinkle, because I think there's a part of your story that I think resonates with me. And I think it's hard. As I'm young, I'm a college student, I'm making this transition into it. It's easy for me to find time and to find the networking. It might be harder. I might have some fear of doing those things because I'm a little bit younger. But then as you get, as life changes and you get married and there's kids, like all those things change, right? Of how much you can put yourself out there versus your need to balance, right? Of somebody to strike that of like, man, I'm doing too much, I'm not doing enough, or what's really that sweet spot, or what advice would you give to somebody to find that good balance of external networking and kind of focusing on yourself along the way?
Especially if you're trying to find something local, I think looking for local events, and it's not have to be something where you go to something weekly or monthly, right? Find one or two a year that you attend, and you put your effort into really talking to as many people as you can in those networking events, at that conference. At the same time, take advantage of the social media that we have, right? I tell my students all the time, don't be afraid to set up your own blog where you go through and you maybe create videos of, you setting up your own home firewall and troubleshooting the issues you run into along the way. Don't be afraid to make errors. Tell us how you're getting through those errors. How are you working through problems? Using LinkedIn, create your own blogs and articles, interact with other people's blog and articles. And honestly, those names, that's what's going to continue to come up, in the circles where we're hiring. It's easy to put an application in. It's not necessarily easy to make your name stand out unless you are actively making your stand out outside of the application process. And maybe that is one of the more difficult parts of cybersecurity, but I think that's where we can kind of take control for ourselves, right? And prioritize how we're going to do that, make ourselves a little bit more unique and above more than just that resume.
Yeah, it's not really a career that you jump in and you remain stagnant, right? There's always a new skill or always something new to be kind of growing into. So like a lot of times those folks that do jump in are a little stagnant in kind of their approach. And I think the balance here is that might get misconstrued as you've got to do 30 extra hours a month, right? That's not the case. Of like, to your point, is picking a thing or two to kind of continue to learn and hone your craft and finding ways to do. And then I think it just helps you find your passion and your interest within a very large sector and industry of things that you could do. What's a good way for somebody to find that passion, right? I've always there's so many different ways and areas, but how do I explore these things? How do I figure out if I want to do, everybody wants to be a pen tester in SOC analyst, right? But there's a whole lot of other things that exist. What is a great way to explore my options?
Honestly, I think going back to things like LinkedIn and just Googling, what's out there and getting involved. I have a very regular assignment that I require of my students in almost all of my classes. And it's an assignment where it's a weekly cyber event where they have to find something that's taken place in the last week. And they have to essentially write about it. What happened? Why is it important? Was it remediated and how? Usually a one page, very simple. And the reason I do that is I want my students to determine, is this the place for you? If you don't care about what's happening and you find this assignment to be difficult, cybersecurity probably isn't going to be the place for you, regardless of where you want to be, right? If the attacks are just boring and very difficult for you to get through, talk about, and research, probably isn't the space for you. However, if you find yourself looking up these attacks and you're like, I want to know the technical details. What is the malware? How was it created? What is it that it exploited? Or maybe you're on the other side of the house where you're like, who is this actor that did this? What were their motivations? What were they really trying to get to? Are they looking to, create the next Stuxnet that's going to impact, global cyber operations? And I think just researching what's going on in the cyber world, thinking about what it is that makes that spark or that trigger for you, can really help guide that, depending on what questions you're asking.
Do you have any blogs, outlets that you recommend, or I know podcasts are always really popular, or books that you would recommend? Where are your students going to find some of these articles and nuggets of kind of recent events?
The number one place I tell everyone to start, Google. Just Google cyber news today. Now that's a generic, place right off the bat, but it's one that I don't want people to forget about. That's often overlooked. Everyone thinks that there has to be this one place to go to that has all the answers and the right places. And don't get me wrong, there are some great ones, right? Like Bruce Schneider on security, Brian Krebs, Dark Reading, some of these classic ones. And I would say, yeah, dig in, find some great information, from these, classic researchers. Great places to start. But don't be afraid to see what else is out there and what other people are saying. LinkedIn is also a great place. It's where a lot of your, smaller researchers or just people that are passionate about it are putting their own thoughts out there. And it's a great way to compare about what, some of the bigger topics, are being said at the conferences.
I haven't dove into the 23andMe experiment is one that's interesting to me we told you what not to do and they passed the buck to the user. That's such a crazy, unheard of, right? I'm like, it's your fault. We did what we said what we needed to do. I'm kind of curious how that shakes out for future cases down the road, and what the legal aspects of that, legal implications have for the long term. So any other kind of good advice for newcomers, right? Like, we cover a little about current events. We cover a little bit about kind of LinkedIn and the use of that. What's some good professional development things, or, you mentioned like Sec Plus. What are some other fun things to go out there and kind of build some skills out? Maybe some more technical stuff for people.
Mm-hmm. Honestly, for me personally, I find that I make an effort to go to one conference every year. And so we're talking now 12 years of me looking for conferences and new skills and technology. And every time I go somewhere, I do learn something new. A couple of years ago, I finally made it out to Black Hat. And at that point in time, the big new up and coming tool was like automated pen testing. And man, I was skeptical about those tools, right? But I wanted to dig in. I wanted to see how it is that they're happening. How do we prevent it from, creating issues on our networks? What kind of data am I getting? How does it differentiate from vulnerability management? And that's just kind of like one example, right? There's going to constantly be new tools out there, new attacks, new ways of doing things, new laws that are coming up that we need to be aware of. And just for me, it's exposing myself and getting surrounded, by fellow geeks to have those conversations and thoughts that I'm not going to have alone locked up in my office necessarily. So going out to the St. Louis local conferences, going out to Black Hat, which I know isn't necessarily accessible to everyone, but when you find your place, make that one of the goals of saying 1 year, I would love to get out, to Black Hat, going out to Accelerate, going out to Ignite, and even all the vendor conferences, just to expose to these new ideas, to challenge ourselves about what we think we already know. And that's what I think is really going to help with the next steps and those next evolutions for our own professional growth and maturity.
Yeah, COVID had an impact a lot on events, kind of after hours networking things. I think. I can speak primarily to St. Louis for sure, but I assume it's a similar narrative across the country, right? Of just, what's the getting back into the things, finding the right events. So there's been a couple recurrings, but it's exciting. Show Me Con's coming back to St. Louis. That was, was around for quite a few years, and I think had a good following. So that's exciting. I know, data connector, secure world are always, good, inexpensive points of entry for somebody to get in that has good content. I find it's a little different, right? A black hat's going to be much more technical, and you're going to walk through scenarios and things, and you're going to have a lot more kind of ones and twos to your experience, where you're going to go to maybe a secure world or data connectors, and it's still good information. It's just probably a little bit more macro versus micro in the content and delivery, but still good stuff to learn. And then, to kind of echo on your point earlier is, the idea of, talking to vendors, meeting people, finding those folks, you can start to learn a lot of other things around learning opportunities and just simply networking, right? That's a great piece of advice. What's probably been your favorite conference you've been to so far in your time?
So last year I made it out to a mining conference. It wasn't a cybersecurity conference. It wasn't an IT conference. It was specific to mining. And so for those that don't know, Peabody Energy is a coal mining company. That's all they do, mine coal. And for me, it was, continuing to put together why I am here, right? My purpose is to defend against people trying to stop from coal mining. Love it or hate it, it is what it is, right? But I think that we need to remember to challenge ourselves of knowing what our business is and what it is that we're defending, because we also have to communicate that. Not everyone understands that coal mining today is largely a technology process. It is largely automated. And so what do we need to do to make sure that we continue to stay a step ahead in technology developments, know what those new mining technologies are, so I can continue to protect those appropriately. I can't just sit and wait. I need to see what they are actually doing as they continue to develop these different technologies.
Yeah, I always think of like healthcare, right? There's so many new advances that are happening, right? I think it was Gateway to Innovation a couple of years ago. They were just kind of talking about the future of doctors' offices, right? Where you walk in and you've got your table and the person says, "I'm here with patient Kristi Cook," and then it pops in and it's recording us and telling all the things. So then when we're done, we walk out, my report's done, my paperwork's done. It's all automated, probably through the use of AI, which is great. It makes that doctor's life better, our life better. We probably get a recording of our visit forever. But then there's all of those things are touch points that have to now be protected, and your Internet of Things and all of these devices, that have to consider. So it's a great advice, is to really not just always focus on the cyber stuff, but also your industry specific things to understand what trends are coming up in just your sector. So good, great advice. I'm excited about the future of healthcare. I don't know as much about coal, but we're working on it. What's we one of the questions is just around this idea of professional challenges. As you've navigated almost a 15-year career within this, which is exciting. I'm sure you've had many highs and lows. But any kind of challenges or things, or we'll call pitfalls along the way that maybe you've seen people kind of get caught up in, or maybe they were deficient that kind of hindered some of their progression and growth within their career.
So, the biggest thing that I see is the challenge of realizing how social cybersecurity is, not just marketing ourselves and put ourselves out there, but also within the business, right? Again, taking a step back, not everyone understands, technology, how technology works. We've had the comments of, we've mined coal for hundreds of years, we can go back to manual processes if we need to. That's not necessarily always the case, right? Sometimes that takes special permits. Sometimes we don't have those skill sets anymore. And so when technology is prohibited, there isn't that opportunity. We can no longer make that money. We can no longer operate. So a big part of my job really is communicating the value of technology and cybersecurity to make sure that the business knows how we continue to let them function and continue to operate, right? A lot of my counterparts and peers, that's kind of a hard lesson to learn. If the business doesn't understand the value of cybersecurity and how cybersecurity enables that continued technology and that continued development, a lot of times I get stifled. And when budget cuts come up, It might be, well, cybersecurity doesn't actually make us money. They just continue to ask us for more money, for more tools. Maybe they're the ones we need to take money away from. And so having to continue to state, well, we see this, 83% increase in ransomware attacks in the mining sector over the last 18 months. Look at what happened to those companies. They've lost this much money. They were unable to operate for, 3 days to 3 weeks. It's my job to make sure that my leadership's aware of that and how what I am doing today helps ensure that they don't have those pain points tomorrow. And that's, I think, a really big takeaway, where a lot of people just struggle with being able to communicate, that reliance and that need.
Well, I mean, even with just new regulations and SEC coming down, where there's mandates for public boards to have more professionals, right? Like I think to your point, it's reinforcing. We have to get better at just saying the things that we do in less technical terms that are more broad, especially for some of these execs that they're there for different reasons, for the business acumen or insurance knowledge. And now you're trying to teach them cyber things. And the days of saying, like SolarWinds, it was that person's fault, we had nothing to do with it. Like that doesn't fly. Ignorance is not bliss in this scenario. So I'm interested to see kind of, again, where the future of that goes and how corporations and accountability really play into it. As you look ahead to kind of, what's something that you're excited about in the next 2 to 3 years within the industry and the sector, that you think that is on the horizon for us?
Yeah, I don't know about specifically on the horizon, but just in general, I love seeing how the technology is changing. And I know I've already harped on this, but technology in general is growing at such a rapid pace. It can be really hard to keep up with and maintain, awareness of what's going on. What does AI really mean for us? What does different levels of automation mean for us? What's the new IoT, not just in mining, and coal, but what are the new, automated devices that are going? What are we getting to not have to do for ourselves tomorrow, next month, next year? And then because this is the world I live in, I'm like, what's someone going to do to take advantage of that? Right? How are they going to manipulate that new product or that new process for someone else's advantage? Are they going to use it to, steal data? Are they going to use it to hold it ransom in some way? Or is somebody going to do it in a more malicious way to try to hurt people? And those are just the questions I automatically ask myself whenever I see something new, right? New cars. I'm terrified of new cars. I'll be honest. I got a new Explorer 2 years ago, and there are so many like automated, braking technologies and parallel parking assists and things where I'm like, man, these are wonderful, but I don't trust any of it. And I have a very hard time, with the idea of autonomous vehicles and things that I'm not in control of or that even have that capability, because I'm like, what's someone going to do using that technology for malicious purposes?
It's frightening. I'm not the cars about the over the road truckers. That part frightens me. We just have 18-wheelers all across the world just going ham on auto. That seems crazy to me. So I would be remiss, right? We got to ask a question around the title. You gave us a title, which I'm gonna botch this guy's name up. Richard Bajtlich.
Bajtlich, yes.
Bajtlich. So I'll make sure we get in closing. So approved by that. So I know there was a story there, so I want to give you an opportunity to share that story.
Okay, so I talked about the Cyber Shield Capture the Flag that I did with my early days of the military that really got me started. So it was actually at that Capture the Flag. This guy named Richard Bajtlich was in attendance, and he basically said, where's this cyber history girl that I heard about that, had a big part in the process of what happened at this exercise. And so he comes in this room. I have no idea who this guy is at this point, by the way. And he announces, where's that cyber history girl? And these guys in my unit, they start fangirling, like Taylor Swift style, like getting all excited, jumping up and down. And so he comes and he chats with me. And I guess Richard Bajtlich has a background in history also. So we talk about how the relevancy of history, with cybersecurity and identifying threats and what bad guys are up to. And what I didn't know at that time was Richard Bajtlich was actually the CEO of Mandiant, who had just previously released the APT-1 report, which was a massive, I guess, key point in cybersecurity history. Now, I know the APT-1 report was at that point, which for those that aren't aware, was the big documentation that basically called out China for engaging in active cyber warfare. So it was the first time in history we had publicly acknowledged that cyber warfare existed between countries. And so he was a major part of that. I had no idea. And it was fascinating. So as soon as he walked out, the room, the guys all stare and look at me and they're like, "You just touched him. He came over and shook your hand." So it's kind of one of those big moments. And again, it circles back around that cybersecurity is such like this close-knit community that there's so many people that you're gonna meet and talk to who can be like the big, celebrities of cybersecurity, and you might have no idea that you're having a beer with them until at the end, or something like that.
Who would have thought that Richard Bajtlich would be? He's if he tunes into this, I don't think he's going to think he was compared to Taylor Swift today. But
hey, what the celebrity of today is. It'd be hard pressed for anyone to argue, right?
It does not get bigger than Taylor Swift in 2024 for sure. But Kristi, I want to say thank you just for today and the show. I've enjoyed the friendship and just getting to know you over the past years. You've done so much, just I think, for the sector and the industry here in St. Louis. So thank you for all of that. Thank you for being a supporter of CyberUp over the years and believing in apprenticeship and not traditional hiring. Like they've got 2 apprentices that have been there almost 5 years each over the course of time, and have a couple more come on. So exciting. So last question. What advice do you give to everybody to level up their cybersecurity career?
Find your area that you're passionate in and just dig in. That's really all I can say. Challenge yourself, never stop learning, and read the news every single day. That's the #1 key.
I like it. Short, sweet, simple. Current events is definitely important. So thank you today. Thank you for everybody tuning in. Make sure you join us next week. Next week we have Drew Todd with Secure World. We're going to talk about just the importance of conferences. We'll be jumping a little bit more onto this. Lots of great events and professional development, but we do have, I think I've got the next 4 or 5 weeks kind of lined up. So we've got some really good guests coming up. So I'm excited, and Kristi just happened to be one. So again, thank you everybody today. Thank you, Kristi. And until next time, see you soon.
All right, thanks for having me. Bye.